the right time for a new finance minister to deliver on that plan for the long and challenging road ahead. That's why I'll be stepping down as finance minister and as member of parliament for Toronto Centre.
A big shakeup in Ottawa tonight. Bill Morneau has resigned as finance minister and from his seat as an MP. So what was the breaking point? Who is up next for the job? We had to call in at issue for this. They don't ever get a break. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Althea Raj is here in Ottawa. Thank you all for coming back. You're going to have to come back for the Conservative leadership too, but let's start with today. Chantal, when we last talked about this a couple weeks back, you seem to believe that Bill Morneau was not long for his job, and here we are. What do you make of the reasons he gave tonight, and what do you think they really are?
When I told you that 2 weeks ago, I had not yet witnessed what we all witnessed, which was a finance minister left hanging in the wind in the media for the better part of that time. And what led to that, I don't actually believe it's just the we stuff and the trip. I think that Bill Morneau and the Prime Minister had become, and that's becoming a familiar story with this government, that the Prime Minister becomes detached, disconnected from his ministers, and at some point, if it had been me, instead of Bill Morneau watching the coverage and the sources saying this and that, I guess I would have decided that someone wanted me to resign.
And the way that this happened, Andrew, that this bid for the Secretary General of the OECD, how should we read that, do you think?
It's a ridiculous cover story that you would leave as G7 finance minister in the middle of the worst economic crisis in a century, when huge decisions are being made, to have a maybe possible shot at the Secretary General of OECD, which is not a particularly important post, frankly. I think the only reason they hit on that story was to make the philosophical difference cover story seem more plausible by comparison, but I don't find it particularly credible either, that suddenly there's this huge gulf in vision between the finance minister and the prime minister, that suddenly Bill Morneau, who's presided over larger and larger deficits year after year after year, is suddenly recast as this skinflint who's somehow standing in the way of the prime minister's vision. None of that makes sense either. So I guess I'm more in the camp that said this was a dignified way to throw Mr. Morneau overboard without having to raise uncomfortable questions as to why the Prime Minister should not have to walk the plank for the same sins.
Althea, what do you make of the reasoning or the explanations that Mr. Morneau gave today?
Well, I think on this panel, we all agree that the Prime Minister's office basically engineered Bill Morneau's way out of office. The we story, if they had focused on that, would only cast attention on the fact that the Prime Minister was unwilling to resign for the very same offences that they were saying Mr. Morneau had to go. The differences in ideology between Mr. Morneau and Mr. Trudeau have been well known for several years. He was very uncomfortable with the level of federal largesse, shall we say, that was in the very first budget. And at the time, there were other people in the cabinet who also shared his views, like Mr. Bryson, for example. And we did not hear at the time from Mr. Morneau. Mr. Morneau has not been the Jim Flaherty of the Trudeau government. He has not tried to, behind the scenes, let it known that he disagrees with Mr. Trudeau on these things. He's been fiercely loyal. And for that loyalty, he has been rewarded with basically like a smear campaign of sorts that Mr. Trudeau could have put an end to if he had wanted to, and he chose not to.
Okay, so Chantal, you can riff off that if you want, but we are now, at the end of the first wave of a pandemic. I'm not sure we've ever in this country been in a recession, depression without a finance minister. Who should we expect? How soon should we expect it? Probably tomorrow, I'm thinking. But what is your sense of the urgency around that?
Well, there is, it would be unheard of to have an interim finance minister. So yes, the expectation that we will have a finance minister tomorrow makes a lot of sense. Those who still believe that someone like Mark Carney is about to set onto the scene and run in a by-election. Everything we hear tonight is that that is not happening. So expect someone who is currently in cabinet to become the finance minister. That's the general expectation. Whether that will reassure Canadians who are increasingly worried about the management, not of the pandemic, but of the fiscal consequences of the pandemic, is very much an open question. To have a rookie finance minister, even someone who is actually in cabinet at a time like this, is not only particularly challenging, but not confidence-inspiring.
And the challenges that finance minister has to encounter very quickly, Andrew, even if they've been around the cabinet table already, will remain unprecedented even the months ahead.
Yeah, and the biggest challenge is that the prime minister is the real finance minister. He ran the table with Mr. Morneau, frankly, over the years, as his people were boasting about behind the scenes in these anonymous leaks over the last few days. So whoever comes in there, it's a thankless job, because your job as finance minister is to say no, to be the skeptic, to be asking those kind of questions. And if it's clear that the prime minister now views a $343 billion deficit as not nearly enough, and that we need to go into much grander levels of debt, that's a pretty thankless assignment.
Although, Althea, if you appoint someone who you know is sort of on the same page as you, perhaps you removed all the obstacles and challenges that you were presumably going to encounter with Bill Morneau.
Although you have to pause for a second and think, do you want a cabinet with only members who agree with you? Or do you want to have real policy discussion? And you kind of need that back and forth. And I thought it was interesting today when, I asked Minister Morneau what he thought what skill set he thought the next finance minister should have. And he said, well, that's not up to me to decide. It's up to the prime minister. And you could have easily made an argument for Mark Carney, who I'm told is definitely not going to be the finance minister. But, this is a government that likes to virtue signal and say, so-and-so first female finance minister, let's say, appointed, as many of us expect it to be Chrystia Freeland. But if you had to put a white man in that job, you could have said, well, no one really has the credentials that Mark Carney has. But there is nobody at the cabinet table at the moment that has credentials, financial credentials, frankly, that are better than Minister Morneau's. So it will be up to them to try to explain that decision.
I just have a couple of minutes, but what does this, I'm not going to ask you about an election, because I don't think that's what it is, but what does this do to the government's attempt to try and end the talk around the we controversy and turn the page and move to other things? Does it help? Does it hurt, Chantal?
Well, if you're going to take a controversy that for many Canadians remains a small controversy and change the channel to a bigger controversy, which is, do we have a team that is equipped to deal with what may be coming down the road with the pandemic? That's, one way to change the channel, I guess, to lose your finance minister in the middle of a huge crisis. As to Althea's point about having people around the cabinet table that can not always be yes people, I think we may be way past that in the case of this government, considering the list of people who have left, who came with Justin Trudeau to cabinet in 2015.
Interesting. Andrew, just quickly on whether you think this marks, obviously it's a turning point, but whether it's the one that the government wants or not.
I can't see this quieting talk of the we controversy when the finance minister is its most visible and prominent victim. We keep having these scandals that Liberal partisans dismiss as nothing burgers that result in high-level resignations. That's not particularly going to make this go away.
Althea?
Oh, I agree with that. And usually the ethics commissioner continues reports well into whether or not you have resigned. So we should expect that there will be a pronouncement on Mr. Morneau's ethical failings, alleged ethical failings, as well as the Prime Minister's, shortly, perhaps in time for an election.
This is a remarkable day, right? This isn't something that we have seen. We've seen it before, but nothing like this. Am I wrong, Chantal?
No, but then remember that we spent an entire weekend not being able to this day to say whether Paul Martin had been fired or resigned.
That's right.
And the loss of Paul Martin to Jean Chrétien was a serious hit. That Jim Flaherty cut the legs from under Stephen Harper's top campaign economic promise, fiscal promise on income splitting on his way out. So it is not unheard of for prime ministers and ministers of finance to become estranged. They tend not to be doing that less than a year after an election and in the middle of a huge crisis.
Okay, thank you all. I appreciate you all coming in. Please stay by your phones. I'm likely to call again very soon. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. At least they get to stay home and do it. All right, that is at issue for today.